Good afternoon. Welcome to this webinar on CCPA and GDPR. My name is Kishore Baswani, and I'm the Chief Strategy Officer of ControlCase. I really appreciate the time you have taken today to attend this webinar on CCPA and GDPR, which are increasingly becoming very important yardsticks for privacy. A few housekeeping items before we get started. As we go through the webinar today, if you have any questions, please put them in the questions window and we will answer them in the order we receive them. We should have time for a couple of questions. If we don't get to all the questions, we will reply back to you by email for any of the questions we weren't able to get to. Our webinar today should run approximately 30 minutes. A copy of these slides, as well as a recording of this, will be available to all of you early next week. You can also go and register for new webinars at www.controlcase.com or listen to any of our old webinars at www.controlcase.com. Again, as we go through the webinar, if you have any questions, please put them in the questions window. If you have any difficulty hearing or seeing the slides, please put them in the chat window and our moderators will ensure we address any difficulties that may arise. That being said, thank you once again for attending, and let's get right into the webinar. Our agenda today is to touch on GDPR and CCPA at a very high level. I will caveat this presentation with a caveat that CCPA and GDPR is as much a legal field as it is a data/information security field. So obviously, anything that comes out of this webinar, any action items, you should certainly run it by your legal folks and really have legal as a part of your team, because just like with any other regulations, CCPA and GDPR can be interpreted in multiple ways. Obviously, this presentation gives you a general idea, but to make specific policies, you certainly want to make sure you get your legal teams involved. A little bit about ControlCase. We focus on IT compliance, IT certification, and related continuous compliance services. That is a key area of focus of what we do. We pride ourselves on having a partnership approach with our customers and not being a checklist auditor, and using automation wherever possible to streamline the process. And here are some of the certification and compliance services we participate in. As you can see, both for CCPA and GDPR, we do work with customers from an information security perspective and from a data privacy perspective to ensure they're compliant with GDPR and CCPA. Obviously, there is a legal component, as I said, to CCPA and GDPR, which we can partner with law firms, or we work with law firm, the legal side of our customers, to help them get a complete picture on CCPA and GDPR. So we're going to go through, as I said, very high level basics on GDPR and CCPA. And any questions that come up, please put them in the questions window. So what is GDPR? So GDPR was put into place by the European Union and is really applicable across the European Union and the European Economic Area, which includes some additional countries in addition to the EU. It is a privacy regulation, and it really was formed to ensure individuals have control over their personal data, and also that data is private and secure. So no matter where that data gets stored, processed, or transmitted, if it is personal data of an EU or EEA citizen, it certainly is in scope of GDPR, no matter where in the world it flows through or gets stored. For reference, GDPR came into effect in May 2018. When you talk about GDPR, there are certain concepts you'll keep on hearing and certain terminologies you'll keep on hearing. Some of the terminologies and definitions you will hear are the definition of data processor versus controller. Think of controller as the entity that consumers really have the business relationship with, and think of the processor as the entity who probably processes or is a third party to the controller or the business. So the processor and controller relationship is very similar to what you would call a vendor, a third party, for the most part. When you hear of regulation versus directive, directives are legislative acts that set out a goal. Regulations are exactly that, which is it must be followed by everybody, and GDPR is a regulation. And then finally, the DPAs, or the data protection authorities in different countries, are responsible for ensuring they are implementing GDPR within their regions. So, we talked about what is GDPR and whom does it apply to. And the next thing we'll talk about is what are the non-compliance consequences. So, non-compliance consequences are both monetary as well as judicial. And as you said, in case of, as you can see here, in case of a breach, up to 4% of annual global revenues, 20 million euros, whichever is higher, in addition to any judicial remedy. So fairly steep fines when it comes to breaches that might result when a company is not compliant to GDPR. And there are various tiers of fines, obviously. So we talked about GDPR. We talked about the consequences of non-compliance. You hear the word GDPR fields. And so let's talk about what are GDPR fields. A big part of GDPR, as we can all imagine, is online. And when it comes to online, a lot of it ties back to collection of data, personal data that companies do online. And so the GDPR fields basically allow the collection and storage and the appropriate consent as is needed from a GDPR perspective. These are specific fields that are visible on web pages or applications and really form a mechanism to ensure that there are specific checkboxes, disclosures and so forth as a person is filling out their personal information right on the website to ensure these are compliant to GDPR. They in themselves do not make, just having the field does not make a company compliant to GDPR, but it is necessary to have them because this is the first step in making sure you're compliant. Once you collect the data, you obviously have to do many other things when it comes to privacy, sharing, movement, etc. But making sure you have the right level of consent for the right level of GDPR fields when someone is filling out these forms is an important aspect. And so at a 50,000-foot level, GDPR fields, when you hear of that, these are really fields within forms that you fill in online that have to be constructed in a way that, as a first step, they are providing the right level of consent and disclosures and options to be GDPR compliant. And they could be checkboxes, they could be text boxes, and so forth. Now, who does GDPR apply to? So any enterprise, doesn't matter where they are, if you're processing the personal information of individuals inside the European Union or the EEA, GDPR applies to you. So it's very simple. Wherever that privacy data resides is what's applicable to those enterprises. So we talked about GDPR. Just to summarize, it's a EU regulation, really focuses on privacy and makes sure that privacy of data is protected when it's collected online or through applications. There are fines and judicial remedies for not complying with GDPR. And we talked a little bit about the GDPR fields to make sure your forms are architected in the right manner. Next, let's go through just a very 50,000-foot level of how you would go ahead and implement GDPR. When we publish these slides, you will also see a checklist that you can use, and the checklist would be available as a link from our slides when we publish them. You can also go on the World Wide Web and search for ControlCase's GDPR checklist or see our discussion on our blog. But here are some tactical steps you can use to implement GDPR in your organization at a high level, and many of you might already be doing that. So what is required? A data impact assessment, which makes sure that you're understanding how data flows within your organization and looks at the security of data flow right from the point of source when the data comes in all the way through storage and processing. So anytime you make changes, mass changes to your systems or applications or your processing mechanism, you're expected to update your data impact assessment. Obviously, GDPR has been in play for the last couple of years, so many companies have already complied with this aspect of having done a data impact assessment. However, that's not a static thing. We recommend it happen every year so that you get a status on where you are. But at least after any major change, you would want to do a data impact assessment. Number two, organizations need to define a data protection officer. So there needs to be a role that who satisfies this role of a data protection officer. You know, there are various ways it can be done. Can be an employee, can be a consultant, could be part-time, could be full-time. Just depends on the scale of the organization. But having a DPO and having someone assume that responsibility for privacy and security of EU citizen data is a requirement within GDPR. So we talked about doing a data impact assessment. We talked about doing and making sure you have a DPO. Here are 4 other things that need to, can be done to make sure you're going through your GDPR compliance program and tactically addressing it. Security of data, which would be a part of your data impact assessment, is important. Rights management, privacy, and breach notification management. These are 4 other domains that are equally important as the first 2 pieces that we talked about. I will go through some of these at a high level right now. When we talk about security, there are various common security components that a lot of you are familiar with, which are generally security best practices, and GDPR is no different when it says as part of your impact assessment and as part of security, many of these things are expected. Again, the list over here is a ControlCase recommended list to meet the security requirements of GDPR. And so obviously these are not published as is, but ControlCase interprets them in this way. So asset and vulnerability management, making sure assets are secure and don't have vulnerabilities. Data management, you need to know where your data is, right? For the first step in complying to GDPR is knowing where your data resides and how it flows through the system. And once you know where it's stored, it's appropriately classified, encrypted, secured, and monitored. Logical access, making sure you're using 2-factor authentication, strong passwords, and all those different aspects when it comes to accessing EU citizen data. We also talk about physical access, and that would include things like CCTV, biometric, media destruction, badges, and so forth. It is important to do a risk management on an ongoing basis, at least yearly, but possibly also after any major change or on a semi-annual basis. And risk management would help identify any new risks that have creeped up in the system since the last risk assessment was done. Policy management, just like any other security regulation, you would want to make sure you have policies and procedures that address the entire spectrum, and those policies and procedures are distributed, people are trained on it, and acknowledge that they're going to abide by those policies and procedures. Vendor or third-party management, we talked about the processor, and so any third party that manages or accesses data or accesses a critical business process as part of your ecosystem needs to have a cadence of being evaluated, at least on an annual basis, maybe more frequently depending on the criticality, and any items that are found not appropriate, whether contracts or IT issues, should be tracked all the way through closure. And then having an incident management program of monitoring, reporting, responding to incidents is an important aspect of security. So I talked about 4 different areas after we talked about the data protection officer and the DIA. We went through the security checklist. Now let's talk about rights management, which is an important aspect. And there are various rights the individuals have when it comes to rights management. They need to be able to ask for their deletion of their data. They need to be able to ask the processor to restrict on how their data can be used, how the data can be moved around borders and so forth. So the enterprises need to have a process to give these rights to EU citizens to be able to request all these different things. The processor also has to make sure that it is providing disclosures and any breach notifications on an ongoing basis. So all of this would fall under rights management. Then there is privacy management, which means ensuring that consumers have rights to first of all examine what their records are. They have rights such as the right to be forgotten, which means they no longer want to be a part of the ecosystem of the organization, and the other appropriate limits and conditions that can be done to make sure privacy is maintained for individuals. Again, for third parties, making sure they are following similar procedures to the extent they serve your customers, and providing an accounting of disclosures is an important aspect of privacy management. And then the final one is breach notification management. And GDPR is very specific about ensuring that there is a good process if and when a breach does happen, ensuring that there is a tried and tested process to notify the data protection authorities, notify the individuals, notify third parties, customers, and so forth, if and when such a thing happens. And so certainly making sure breach notification has been formally documented, tested, and is a stringent process is an important part of GDPR. And things that should be included as part of breach notification include things like number of records, where has the breach happened from, what's the consequences, and what are you going to do about it in terms of mitigating the breach. So breach notification management is an important aspect. So we just finished our section on GDPR. Just to recap, we will be sending out a copy of these slides. We also have a checklist which can go over these items in a checkbox manner to see that you have a program for these different aspects from a GDPR perspective. Next, we're going to get into CCPA. And before we end the webinar in about 10 more minutes, we will compare and contrast GDPR and CCPA. So what is CCPA? So CCPA is the California Consumer Privacy Act. And very similar to GDPR, it is related to personal information. Anything that relates to consumers or households, and CCPA was built to protect the personal information of consumers. It's CCPA, it's a California law, certainly applies to California residents, but obviously applies all over the US because, as we probably can imagine, every company or most companies in the country would probably have California residents as their customers or have information on that. When does CCPA go into effect? It's already into effect. It came into effect early last year, January 1st, 2020. Obviously, from then till now has been a very interesting 15 months, but we are already into the 15 months of CCPA having come into effect. Whom does it apply to? Okay, so it applies to entities that have gross revenue of over 25 million, or, and again, remember, it's or they hold personal information of 50,000 or more Californian consumer households, or they derive 50% or more of its annual revenues by selling information on consumers. So again, it doesn't have to be and, any one of these, and the company is responsible for, falls under CCPA regulation. How to implement CCPA? We talked about how to implement GDPR. Similar to that, we're going to talk as we get closer to the end of this webinar on how to implement CCPA, and our checklist will also obviously cover that. There are really 4 high-level areas that form a part of CCPA. One is the concept of reasonable security. Again, we at ControlCase, I will not go through the different domains of security, but as you can see, the same domains that I talked about earlier, we feel are reasonable from a security perspective when it comes to CCPA. Obviously, you would want to match that against your program, run it through your legal counsel, but having reasonable security is an important aspect of CCPA. And then there are other ones: verification, privacy management, and rights management. And obviously you'll recognize privacy and rights management even from GDPR. So there's a significant amount of overlap between GDPR and CCPA if you're thinking about it. And that's good, because as more and more privacy regulations come out, you're going to see similar kinds of regulations or aspects to privacy regulations. And in fact, many countries have privacy regulations now. Many states have privacy regulations, and it's only going to increase. But more or less, they all kind of point in the same direction. So we talked about security. CCPA does talk about verification, which means when a request is made by a consumer to do anything with their data, it is necessary to confirm the identity of the petitioner. Sometimes it can be made by a guardian or a parent. Multiple channels may be used for making the request. A number of variables and preferences might vary. So it's important to make sure you do verify a consumer before you respond back, obviously. And some cautions, don't use, whatever process you put in place for verification, make sure you're not now storing additional data because of that. So if you're using licenses for verification of a consumer, don't start storing that, because that then becomes additional consumer data. And so that's a word of caution here. From a privacy management, certainly making sure that, again, the appropriate safeguards exist to protect the privacy is an important aspect. Giving individuals the right to ensure their information cannot be sold, giving individuals the right to obtain a copy of their records or request that it be deleted These are all privacy-related aspects. There are some caveats here too. Deletion can only be requested if you have collected that data directly from that consumer, and so they can request that. You can do it for third parties. If a company requires some sort of data for legitimate processing purposes, so if a bank wants it for processing statements, then that's a legitimate purpose, and obviously the consumer cannot ask to delete those records and systems. And finally, from a rights management, when it comes to CCPA, the right to know, the right to access, the right to delete, and the right to opt out are some of the important rights. While there's nothing specific, certainly from a third-party perspective, making sure they disclose any breaches or any bad security incidents, and a full disclosure of accounting of disclosures from third party is a best practice, not necessarily spelled out when it comes to rights management. There are some other CCPA issues. We talked about some of this, things like annual notice updates. There are obviously penalties that can be wide-ranging on a per record loss basis, but certainly determined by the state of California. We talked about verification, so residency verifications. There are some opt-out procedures, some exemptions. So there are other CCPA issues, and some of these we'll have in our checklist that we provide. Just a reminder, we have a few more minutes for the webinar to go on. Please continue to put any questions in the questions window. We will have time to answer a couple of them, and then the remainders we will email you or set up some time with you to answer those. So GDPR versus CCPA. This is just intended to reinstate my earlier point, which is as more and more privacy regulations come out, there's a fair amount, while there's some differences, there's a fair amount of similarity between this, and it's expected that there will be a fair amount of similarity in other privacy regulations. I'm not going to go through each one, but if you see, privacy requirements are common. Consumer rights are common. Fines for legal liabilities are common. There are some differences, such as is a data impact assessment required or recommended, is verification required, and things like that, which may not be officially spelled out in the law exactly the same. But the general theme, as you can see on the left-hand side, would be very, very similar if you added a third privacy regulation or a fourth privacy regulation. A lot of these same fundamental concepts do apply. Why ControlCase? So we focus on IT compliance and IT certification. Certainly a big part of GDPR and CCPA is IT compliance and IT certification, and we at ControlCase do it. Obviously, as I mentioned earlier, GDPR and CCPA includes a legal component, and we work with the legal firms of our clients or in partnership with them to address that aspect. But certainly, our focus is on IT compliance certifications to GDPR, CCPA, and all these other regulations that we do. We, in fact, do one audit very commonly, which is do a single assessment and make sure you're compliant or certified to multiple regulations to reduce audit fatigue. We can do certifications and compliance as a one-time activity, which is annually, or it can be continuous, automated, and integrated. And again, at ControlCase, certainly we look forward to a partnership approach with our customers. We use automation, and we try to keep it as a business as usual continuous compliance aspect versus a once-in-a-year aspect. Thank you for attending this webinar. I'm going to answer any questions now. When we send out these slides, keep an eye out for these links, which is the CCPA versus GDPR resource and checklist guide, and then our blog, where you can also learn more about CCPA and GDPR. That being said, I am now going to go and answer the questions which have been put in here. There are bunch of them. I will answer just a few of them, and the remaining we will email you. The first question is, for the security items of CCPA and GDPR, is there overlap with other regulations? And that's a great question. And in security, some of the domains we looked at, asset and vulnerability management, data management, and so forth. The things that have to be done for protection of consumer data are very similar to what are things that need to be done for other regulations, whether it's credit card data for PCI or healthcare data for HIPAA. So the controls and that exist for the security aspect only are very similar to other regulations. Now, both GDPR and CCPA have something that other IT regulations don't have, which is a legal/privacy component to it, which would be not common in other security-centric regulations that exist out there. But for the most part, the security aspects are very common between both GDPR, CCPA, and any of the other regulations. I have time for one more question that I will answer, and we will send out the remaining by email. The question is, are there, what are some of the other regulations that might exist out there that are similar to CCPA or GDPR, and does CCPA and GDPR apply outside EU and California? So that's a great question. So I'll probably answer these 2 or 3 questions that I kind of combined into maybe 3 specific key insights that I think are important. The first key insight is all the programs have very similar components. So as you are building a privacy program in your organization, you want to make sure you're not building 6 different privacy programs for 6 different regulations. You want to do it once and then map them to different regulations. And then number 2, if a new regulation comes out, you might have to update your program a little bit, but for the most part, it'll probably remain the same. So that's number 1, and making sure you're having a consistent privacy program that addresses multiple regulations is important. Number 2, when it comes to CCPA, which is California related, or GDPR, which is EU related, it applies to any company globally that has California citizen data or EU citizen data. So as you can imagine, it does, the companies don't have to be headquartered in California or EU. They could be in any place in the world, and as long as they are either a third party to a company that has this kind of data, or they themselves have this kind of data, which is on California residents or EU residents, and clearly any global company that serves multiple customers is by default going to have some EU citizens and California citizens 95% of the time. So the impact of CCPA and GDPR is far-reaching and will touch almost every company, no matter where they are located. And then you add that on the privacy regulations that the local countries are coming out with. Safe to say, you want to build a privacy program that addresses multiple regulations, including CCPA and GDPR. That was all the time I had. I see a bunch of other questions. We will make sure we email back you the responses if we weren't able to get to it. Hope you enjoyed the webinar. A recording will be available next week. We'll send out a copy of these slides and the checklist, as well as feel free to come to www.controlcase.com for any future webinars or listening to any past webinars. Thank you and have a great day.